Welcome to another of our series of videos with Sandy Matheson, freeman of the Western Isles and holder over the years of many posts of importance in our islands. Sandy has agreed to do this in the hope that by talking to us we will have a record, his record, of his life and times here in the town. Now, I think we finished last week with the Cóla in Yelanshire, a hugely important event in the life of the Western Isles and in your own life too.
Yes. Well, I have often reflected on the changes that occurred in the island because of the creation of the coal. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the almost terminal decline of our community was stopped in its tracks by the creation of the coal. I don't know how to put it in community psychological terms, but something that I find difficult to define happened. It seems now as if it had to do with this thing I call community confidence. The entire outlook of the people changed. Hitherto, my own contemporaries, all when they reached the stage of leaving school and going to follow their careers, none of them, or very few of them, had seen local government as a career. And most of them went away to work in a variety of positions and places throughout Britain, and I dare say in Australia and New Zealand and in America, Canada. But the creation of the coal not only created a new sphere of interest for school leavers to take employment in local government, but it did this thing which changed the attitude and outlook of so many people. It was also part of the offshoot of a growing interest in community in government. The government in 1965 had created the Highlands and Islands Development Board, which began the process of change, but it was all rather laboured and it was dependent on the creation of jobs. What the Corps did was really something different. It gave an added impetus to the work of the Highlands and Islands Development Board. And in its own early decision taking, it did this thing that I try to define as the psychological aspects of community life. And the most important step in that process was the adoption of bilingualism. I have no doubt whatsoever that these three things, the Highland Board, the Corps, and the bilingual policy, all happily came at much the same time and all did wonderful things for our own self-confidence as an island. The Tweed industry had in some ways held the island together, but even in the 60s it was beginning to show signs of not being the money spinner, employment giver that it had been. And if you look a wee bit further back, the Second World War had helped to create jobs. It had helped to create an atmosphere, an outgoing atmosphere where the local people were perhaps for the first time meeting many servicemen came here during the war, bringing their own attitudes and ideas. I will never forget the first time I saw a black gentleman. He was an American military policeman. He seemed to me, at my age and size, to be a giant. And he was standing on what we now call Boots Corner, swinging, what they call them, a riot stick or something. He had a huge, long cudgel, as I thought, and he was standing there on the corner, spinning it around. And that, to me, epitomised much of the nascent change. I think that the Corps somehow caught the moment beautifully under the guidance of Roy Maciver and various other people who came in. There was a slight tension, if I remember it correctly, with all these mainlanders coming in here taking jobs. They weren't taking jobs, they were actually creating jobs. So to my mind, and perhaps to put it in its nutshell, we owe our current success to the creation of the Corps.
There was another organisation, and you were involved with it from a very early stage too, and that was the Health Board, and you were chairman of the Health Board as well. Tell us what that was like when you joined and how it progressed.
Well, that is another ingredient of the psychological change. And before the creation of a Health Board, the health services had been supplied out of Inverness through the Regional Hospital Board and out of Rossshire, Dingwall, through what was called the Executive Council. The Regional Hospital Board, as the name implies, was to do with the management and running of the hospitals. Remember, we're only 10, 15 years after the creation of a National Health Service. And the general practitioner services were worked out of Dingwall through what I call the Executive Council. In some ways it was like the County Council. But the essence of these things was that decisions were taken by other people than Louis people on the mainland. And also when I joined the Health Board on its formation in 1974, I had been nominated by my own professional body, the Pharmaceutical Society, and I was one of the, big word, the founding members. But I came into a sphere that I only knew by happenstance and by word of mouth rather than by practical experience. It was basically management rather than policy making. Certain aspects of policy were made in the pursuit of management, but we did not have the fundamental thing that the council had. The council could see a gap and could immediately set about filling it. In the health service, we were still hidebound by having to go through the government to get things done.
Who were the people on the Health Board and at the time?
Well, there was Mr. Robert Stewart, one of the leading men in the Harris Tweed industry. There was Dr. Gregg from the hospital side. There were some general practitioners, and I'm trying to recall how I knew most of them, and they had been plucked from other spheres in the island. What I can say in sharp contrast to things now, every single member of the Health Board lived and worked, and in most cases had their early life grown up here, but not all of them. So it was close to the people, it responded to their problems and complaints even, but one of the things that struck me was we were in desperate need of a new hospital. The case had been argued for 10 years before the formation of the Western Isles Health Board. But the desire became clamant after the formation of the board, although it took nearly another 20 years before the current hospital that we have was provided. And the impetus for that came from a lady that I mentioned often before, Mrs. Mary Macmillan. I think she twinkled her eyes at one of the leading Scottish office people in finance, and she knew a personal friend, the Minister for Health in Scotland, and I think she put her best foot forward and her best smile forward, and she was really the person who got the go ahead for the hospital.
The health board was different to the council also in that it was appointed, not elected.
Not elected. Oh, that's a very important point. We were all appointed from different spheres in the community. How can I put it? There was no question whatsoever of people being elected to it, any more than there is now. So that also helped me to understand an important aspect of it. Sometimes certain bodies are better able to do what the remit is by not being elected. I mentioned last week when we were talking about the Stornoway Trust, the pros and cons of elected as opposed to appointed. And I do think that the health board would not have been as progressive as it was if we had to deal with elected people who quite naturally have their own interests and projects to put forward as they see it on behalf of the community that they represent. But that can, as I keep on saying, have a downside. The health board, we had great problems finding somewhere to meet. We had great problems keeping abreast of the changes, the national changes that were taking place throughout Scotland and indeed throughout the United Kingdom. But the mere fact that we knew our own community also had a positive effect on the government. I often ponder the fact that government tends to be centralistic and tends to take the view that the locals don't know what they're doing and aren't really capable of doing things. And I think we certainly disproved that notion that was prevalent in the central belt, central government.
I don't know why, but names like Jim Glover, Miss McLean come to my mind when I think about the early days of the health board.
Yes, well, Jim Glover came after the health board had been formed, as did Miss Christine McLean, who was a nurse, and she represented the nursing community. She became what was called the CANO, Chief Administrative Nursing Officer. Administrative was the word. She wasn't the first. Another lady had been there in the very beginning. Then Christine came. Jim Glover came later on, and he was a very capable man, and he quickly adapted to the philosophy that people like myself held, that we knew what was good for us, and his job was not to tell us what was good for us, but to do what we said was good for us. And in that sense, Jim was really excellent. There was another officer, Mr. Dick, who was the chief financial officer, and therefore his job was more to do with straightforward administration, not with policy making or anything of the sort. And his influence was of some importance in arguing the financial case for the new hospital. Before Jim Glover, the first chief administrative officer of the health board was a gentleman called Jim Patterson, who had been the chief of the hospital before that. He had been here since about 1958-59, purely as an administrative officer within the parameters of the existing Louis Hospital, which, as I said, was part of the Northern Regional Hospital Board.
We grew up being familiar with the old Lewis Hospital, with the old county hospital, and with the ladies, and it was ladies, who ran these hospitals.
Well, this Cheerful Louis Hospital is something that I've done a couple of lectures on, and it had been founded way back in 1896, largely at the behest of Major Duncan Matheson, the nephew and successor to Sir James Matheson, the owner of the island. And there had been a great desire to build a hospital. It took them many years to identify a site and get it built. But again, it was not built by government grant. The money came from a whole variety of different private organisations. One of the good sources of finance for the new hospital was actually Canada, a way people from of Louis extraction had raised money and gave donations. One of them was quite interesting in current day terms, a gentleman called Hector Sinclair, and his he had a nephew who lived in a Stornoway house in Ottawa, and he had a newspaper, and he used his influence to get expatriate islanders to give money and donations to the new hospital, which was built as we knew it up at the top of Coutill Road.
If my memory is right, Stornoway House is the house of the chief of the opposition in Canada, in the Canadian Parliament, is it?
Yes, that's correct. That was who Hector Sinclair's descendants were.
I remember people like Mary Jane MacLeod, matron in the county hospital, Miss Monroe in the Lewis Hospital.
Mary Jane certainly was a character. She was the matron, as you see, of the county hospital, which had really been built to meet the terrible scourge of tuberculosis. I remember Mary Jane as being something of a firebrand. She didn't suffer fools gladly. I remember once going out to visit my own aged aunt, and I went out to her room in the county hospital to find the bed empty. And I thought, oh my goodness, has Auntie Chrissie died? When, no, one of the nurses came in and looked at me and she said, oh, I said, where's Auntie Chrissie? Oh, she's in the cooler, says the nurse. In the cooler. And I looked at the nurse and said, what is the cooler and where is it? Auntie Chrissie, she said, has been bad and upset Mary Jane. the matron. So she has been put to the cooler, which is down that corridor, turn right, and what. So I made my way to the cooler, which was a small bedroom ward in one of the more far out parts of the county hospital. And here was Auntie Chrissie sitting in bed, as dour as you want, because she had a room all to herself and she was getting special treatment. So that was Mary Jane and the cooler. There was also another part of the hospital called the isolation ward, which in our day was in the county hospital, but previous to that had been down in at Mossend on the edge of Stornoway, just up from Oliver's Bray, and that was the isolation ward where people for things like chickenpox, measles, and these common infectious diseases, people were put in isolation there. I've forgotten the name of the matron of that one, but she too was quite a character. One of her patients in the 1930s, a great friend of my own, and we're used to the late, great Malcolm McFarlane,
Oh, yeah.
was in there on one occasion because he had measles or chickenpox, and they were, for reasons which bear no relationship to good medicine, they were fed everything that was good except fruit. Now that seems to me to be rather strange, but the mother of one of the young patients brought in apples, and the matron thought that she had impounded them, but somehow one apple, it's almost biblical this, one apple escaped and a boy got it, and he very kindly shared it, rather like Eve. He shared the apple, but the matron found the core of the apple or something, so she held a court-martial, and ultimately the boy who had shared the apple was identified, and he was promptly thrashed in front of the other patients. So, and that story came to me from Mal McFarlane, and it shows just how different things were. He was a poor child, not very well, away from home. He had been given a treat of an apple, and he got a thrashing for it.
Being chairman of the Western Isles Health Board, like being chairman of all public authorities, I am sure though had its stresses and burdens, as people's expectations are more than can be delivered.
I have never been able to answer where my ability, if one can call it that, as a chairman developed. It might have been in Aberdeen in the College Debating Society, I can't remember where it began, but all of a sudden I found out I had what all chairmen should have, the ability to listen, to bring people in and encourage them to say something, as well as having a very sound knowledge of the rules of procedure. When I was a student in Aberdeen, goodness knows how, I suddenly found myself as the chairman of the Athletic Association. Me, I suppose, in terms of athletic activity, to be the chair was the best place for me. But
Of the university, was it?
it was at college. I remember taking the place by storm at the very first meeting of the Athletic Association. I was sitting with my peers round the table and shuffling nervously on my bottom of the chair, when suddenly the chair gave a huge big crack, as it sometimes happens, And I, without batting an eyelid or really knowing what I was saying, but conscious of the need to cover my faux pas and making the noise, I said, as the chair cracked, "My apologies to the chair." I was meaning to the chairman, not to the chair I was sitting on. But everybody thought this was tremendous to say my apologies to the chair. They thought I was being far cleverer than I was. So I continued as chairman of the Athletic Association, and I think it was there watching, as you know, student debates. I've always done very properly and with an eye to correct form and all the rest of it. I often think that is where I got my
skill. Early
lessons in chairmanship, which stood me in good stead.
You mentioned earlier on about the place Harris Tweed had in the community, and to a lesser extent continues to have. And you've got a family relationship to the Harris Tweed in that your sister wrote what is looked upon as the best history of Harris Tweed, your sister Janet.
That's correct.
How did you become involved in the Harris Tweed Authority? Because you were on it and then you were chair of it.
Again, the Harris Tweed Authority was by appointment at the hand of the Sheriff Principal, and he always promulgated the appointment, the warrant to be on the Harris Tweed Association as it was. And somebody must have said, well, there's this guy around the town who dabbles in that sort of thing. Possibly it was done by Jim Grant, who was the chair of the Harris Tweed Association as it was then. I'm not sure, I never found out, except that one day I got a letter saying Sheriff Principal Campbell is minded to appoint you to the association. Will you accept? Now, my mother, God bless her, never taught me how to turn down an invitation. So if somebody asked me to do something, I could never say no. I would say yes. And I enjoyed my time on the Harris Tweed Authority. It was, as you know, the Harris Tweed Authority, it was a statutory body empowered to stamp. Its main function was to put the seal of official approval on the Tweed with the stamp. And that is where the sheriff came into it.
You were involved in the Harris Tweed Association, authority as it is now, at a very interesting time because it was still a very busy industry at that time.
Yes.
And many people were gaining employment, maybe 500 in the mills, maybe 1,200 weaving throughout the island. So what did you have to do?
What did I have to do? Attend the meetings, pour out considerable wisdom and experience, and generally act as an extra voice. Again, there wasn't an awful lot of policy because all the policy had been sorted out 10, 15 years before I came on to the HTA in the famous Hunter judgment. There, as you know, Harris Tweed has got to be made in certain places under certain circumstances, and there had been a huge judgment where a gentleman called James MacDonald had Jimmy Todd, to give him his full name, had tried to make and market Harris Tweed, which was actually made in Oban, not in Stornoway. Part of my memory of the peculiarity of the making of Harris Tweed was what we called the colonies, where
yes.
people had a shed. You weren't allowed to make it in your home, but if you had a shed at the bottom of the garden, or if you had a shed as in the colonies, you could make Harris tweed. You could weave the Harris tweed there. And as you know, the whole system was based on the Harris tweed mills. They didn't weave the tweed. They merely washed it, prepared the wool with the warping and the patterns and so forth. They gave the frames of the wool out to the independent weavers. And when they had finished it, it was taken into the mill where it was washed, ironed, and all the rest of it. And I, as a child, had often been taken on a tour round the Harris Tweed mills, in particular Newell's mill on James Street. When our family had visitors who came home, one of the essential parts of their visit was to be taken round a Harris Tweed mill. And as I grew up to early teens, my granduncle, Roddy Smith, when his relations would come from Canada or America, I was deputed to walk them to the mill and go round the mill with them. So I had some sort of idea of the process of the finishing, as it was called, and the preparation of the wool for going out. I'm sure you'll remember the longest vehicle we ever saw, the Harris Tweed lorry. It was owned by Kenneth Mackenzie Limited, and that would take the raw material, as it were, out to the weavers. You'll know more about the actual weaving than I did.
The interesting thing about that vehicle, I'm not sure if it's still there, but not all that long ago, it was still lying beside the main road on the Stornoway Harris Road. Am I not right?
It was lying beside the main road at the bottom of the Cleasham.
Yes.
In Ardvorley, I think.
Yes.
And I remember it coming on the Loch Seaforth and being swung off the Loch Seaforth on the derricks. It has gone now. I suspect the chassis is still probably hidden amongst the grass. One
of my own memories of Stornoway Harris Tweed is a Mr. Lawrence and his Rolls Royce.
Oh yes, Mr. Lawrence was a character. He married the boss's daughter, the boss being Mr. Smith of Peterhead, hence the name Smith's Mill. And Mr. Smith had been the provost of Peterhead, and he came and set up a mill here. Sister Janet would keep me right on that, but she can't do that now. And Mr. Lawrence, as it happened, just was my next door neighbour in Gotill Road. Not that I knew him particularly well. I knew his son a bit better, Ian Lawrence, because Ian's house was built on a spare piece of ground that we in the Gotill used for a football field. And that didn't go down particularly well with the budding footballers from Gotill. But Mr. Lawrence was also the lay preacher in one of the Brethren groups. I don't know which one, but he had his gathering hall in the seminary on Keith Street and Scotland Street, which is now housing, and it was next door to where another character lived, Duncan Major Morrison, the travelling piano teacher. Did he teach you music in back?
Well, he didn't teach the piano. He tried to teach us to sing.
Yes, so he taught you to sing. Well, he taught my sisters to play the piano.
What did he?
He was
a freeman of the Western Isles?
And he was indeed a freeman of the island. I would be including Major in my own list of people who left a positive mark with me.
One of the huge influences on the Harris Street industry was Hunter, Lord Hunter, and his decision in terms of what was Harris Street and what wasn't. And then your own sister Janet Hunter writing the book that many regard as the main book with the history of the Harris Street.
Yes, I think the impetus for the book came from Callum MacLeod, a solicitor in Aberdeen, who was chairman of the Harris Tweed Authority. And Callum was the son of a well-known Church of Scotland minister called Lachie MacLeod. And Callum was chairman in my day. And I remember him saying, somebody had said, let's get a book together. And Callum, who was a friend of my sister Janet in Aberdeen, said, well, I know the person who can write it. And that's how Janet was given the commission to write it.
He was also chairman of Grampian Television, as was at the time.
Correct.
The Tweed, you know, hugely influential in shaping the Lewis as we know it today, and my generation anyway. You were involved though with organisations to do with the islands. You mentioned last week the Conference of Peripheral Maritime Regions and the Island Council. You were president of that, but you were also later chairman of Highlands and Islands Airports. Tell me about that.
Well, it all began with an advert I saw looking for a chairman for David McBrain's, Caledonian McBrain's. And I thought, well, I'd like to have a go at that. And I applied. And I was bombed out without an interview by a top civil servant in the transport division. And I was annoyed, not because I didn't get the job, because in point of fact the job went to a very, very sensible man from Greenock, who had been a town councillor in Greenock. He got that job, but I was so angry that I hadn't been granted an interview. And I suspected it was the old business. We will not have someone from the area on the board. And I complained, raised a formal complaint, which was heard by Dame Rennie something, and she found in my favour, and she said she could find no reason whatsoever why I had not been granted an interview, if only to act as a counter to other people. And the man who had bombed me out, he came to visit me because he had been told by the chair of the commission to come and apologise to me, which he did with ill-concealed lack of grace, if I can put it like that. And shortly after that, the post of chairman of HIAL, Highlands and Islands Airports Limited, was advertised, and I said, well, I'm going for this and I'm going to get it. I went, was interviewed, and did I get it? No, I didn't. Again, the same gentleman, Kenneth Mackenzie was his name, had me bombed out, and the position was given to somebody else who had been actually on the board before. Now, this gentleman was actually very gracious and kind, because whenever he heard that I had been appointed, he came to speak to me, and he said, I was in for the job too, but they've chosen you and I'll be very happy to work alongside you. His name was Bill Brackenridge. But the outgoing chairman was of the same ilk as Kenneth Mackenzie, did not like locals to be in it. He lived in Inverness, and where can be more local to the centre of HIAL than Inverness? Anyway, Peter Grant was his name. He was not particularly nice or kind to me, but having gone through that, largely as I discovered much later on, due to the intervention of the MSP, Alistair Morrison, who had gone to the guys and said, this is nonsense. You should have somebody like Sandy Matheson. He's applied, he should be appointed. And I always understood it was due to Alistair's intervention that I was appointed, because I remember distinctly at one early meeting, or not a formal meeting but an informal meeting with the retirement chairman, he was most scathing about my supposed inability. And he said to me, and I didn't understand it at the time, I do not approve of political appointments. He obviously knew that Alistair had been wanting me to be appointed. And I was able to say to the same Peter Grant, you may not like political appointments, but would you mind telling me how you got yours? He had been appointed by a Conservative government. So, it was
What did he say?
He didn't say anything. He was completely speechless.
And at that time, though, you didn't know that Alistair Morrison had put in a word for you?
No, I didn't know that until when Peter Grant said to me he didn't like political. I didn't know what he was talking about. It was only later on when I made it my business to find out why.
But having said that, well, the process might have been a bit tedious and a bit vexing. You were then chairman of Highlands and Islands Airport at a very interesting time.
One of the civil servants who was in at my interview, lady, she had been there just as a backup assistant, possibly taking the minutes. She went out of her way when I was chairman to help me, and she's still a close personal friend of mine, Grace Maguire, a lovely lady. She's retired, she lives in Edinburgh now, but she, I suppose, had her own opinion on the constant pushing aside of candidates because they weren't from the mainland. And of course, a significant but under noted person in all of this was Bob MacLeod. Robert MacLeod, happily Louisman, a very talented man who had been chief executive of Caledonian Airways, British Caledonian Airways. He could fly a helicopter, and he had been appointed the chief executive of HIAL some years before I came along. And you would know Bob because he's a brother of another gentleman that we met often enough, Donald George MacLeod.
And he's also a good accordion player.
Bob was an excellent accordion player. And one of the interesting aspects of the work at HIAL was the government always appointed a person who attended our meetings and sat in on them to keep us in the government picture and to keep the government in our picture. And I knew two or three of them, worked with two or three of them, and the last one I worked with, we just somehow clicked. and we got on very well indeed. And I often wished that I'd been able to carry on HIAL. I dare say I could if I had wanted to, but by that time my deafness had got really out of hand, and I was unwell from leukemia, and I didn't really think I could do a job justice. So I said, no, I'm not going to go forward for a third term.
But you and Bob MacLeod, it is well known, were a good team.
Yes, not only was my service with HIAL a pleasure, it was a good thing that we were able to work together. I have to say that I've been blessed with every single chief executive that I've worked with. We have got on well, and we're able to disagree without it becoming personal, and we often found that our own common background in Lewis was of great benefit.
Remind me of some of the issues that you had to deal with at HIAL.
Well, again, much of it was to do with executive management of what companies came to serve, because, for instance, Loganair, who were our main customers, they had to meet government standards in order to get government clearance and in order to capture certain amount of money to supply the service, because the service in itself wasn't self-financing. There would have been no Benbecula Barra services if it hadn't been for this scheme, which was managed by HIAL on behalf of the Scottish Government. That was what it was mostly to do with. It also had to do with operations like airport fire services, maintenance of the airports, in fact, creating new airports as we did. When I went on to HIAL owned 10 airports, and by the time I had left, that had gone up to 12, because we had added Oban and Dundee to that list of airports.
You were also improving and building new departure lounges and this at places like Stornoway in Inverness.
That's right. And Benbecula, and also we had to do with the remodeling, not building, but the remodeling of the most famous airport in the world at Barra. And one of my happier experiences was we did an annual visit to every single one of our airports. And at that time, the Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation had an aircraft which they used to test the approach things like the radar and so forth at all of our airports. And there was an agreement, I had nothing to do with it, that the MCA plane would come and do all the testing, and they wouldn't be charged for landing fees because they were doing a job for us. And somehow it turned out that there are spare seats on this lovely little executive jet, and instead of having to go by horse and cart down to places like Connell Ferry in Oban, we would get a lift on the MCA jet. And I remember one morning having my breakfast in Campbelltown, it was, in the hotel in Campbelltown, and given a lift back home, not to Inverness, but direct to Stornoway. And I came off the jet at Stornoway 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was a certain lady, couldn't believe her eyes that I was getting transported by jet home. So it was very exciting and interesting times.
Now, you've been telling us about all these many bodies that you were involved with. I know, I think, the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you, most of these bodies you were involved with for nothing.
Council, no payment. They give you, what's it called?
Attendance allowance.
Attendance allowance. Health board, no payment. Tweed, no payment. I did get a payment for HIAL. Can't even remember what it was now, but it was not a huge amount of money. And of course, in all these things, you got your travelling expenses paid. Otherwise, of course, wouldn't have been able to do it.
So the question is, why?
Why what?
Why bother?
Why bother? Pay me.
No, why bother doing it all when you got nothing for it?
Why did I do all that? Because, as I told you, my mother never taught me how to say no. I don't know. Again, it's worth repeating, I would never have done any of it without devoted patience, loyalty, encouragement and help of my wife and my family, who made no great demands on me to stay at home or anything like that. So, I don't know. Is it some kind of egomania? I don't know. Why bother? That's an interesting question.
Well, that's the question we'll leave today with, and thank you once again, Sandy, for sharing with us snippets to do with the various activities you've been involved in. We're not quite finished yet. We've got one or two more to do, but in the meantime, thank you very much indeed.
I look forward to being with you both next week.